ladies and gentlemen, I am Dark Riddler. Welcome. We gonna do another raid. That's serious. I was supposed to do what I came in. I ended up eating and I crashed out. And I woke up about 11 o'clock. So we just gonna do it now. It don't matter how long to get done, you know what I mean? And um, I think we're gonna do 2 types. We're gonna do 3 and 4. I think we're gonna do 3 and 4. Also, again, first time ever doing the whole book. So like, bear with me again, cause yeah, I've never really actually did this kind of thing. Kick back, relax, all that good stuff. Got my coffee. I'm 100% ready to go to do this. But we're gonna try to get through three and 4. So sit back, relax, all that good stuff, and we just gonna do it. Let the music play, y'all. Okay. Pull this closer to me. I try to keep somebody told me a trick, just go like that. Chapter 3, Tainted Light. As Sarah jumped awake at the sound of the loud bang on the door, she looked up, her heart racing. The door was closing still. What on earth had caused that? A second loud bang came from the door, then another. As Sarah was frightened and held the covers of her bed up so only her eyes and the top of her head could be seen. The banging continued, then the door began to splinter, as what looked like an axe began to be seen with each bang on the door. As Sarah flinched, as splinters and chips flew across the room. Then when the hole was about the size of her head, the banging stopped. As Sarah still held the banging up, as she stared in horror at the door. Suddenly the face of a rather unremarkable ugly goblin forced his way through the hole and began looking around the room. As Sarah froze with fear, unable to look away. Soon, the goblin looked her way, and the two made eye contact. Both sides froze for a moment, then they both screamed. Suddenly, the goblin's face disappeared through the door again, and the banging continued, this time much faster and more violent. As Sarah didn't know what to do and just sat there helplessly watching until the hole in the door grew large enough for at least one goblin to fit its way through. As soon as it was, several goblins attempted to force their way in, causing the weakened door to creak and splinter some more. Then the door gave way to a wave of goblins who spilled into the room, laughing mechanically and making their way towards her. Ashterra screamed as they grabbed her. She kicked and tried to get away, but was eventually lifted into the air on the backs of the goblins and carried out the door. Ashterra was terrified of what was happening. Where were they taking her? What had she done for them to break down her door and kidnap her? Soon she found herself being carried into the throne room. Why had they brought her here? Suddenly her stomach lurched as she was thrown and came crashing down on the black marble floor. The fall caused her to bite her tongue and hit her head on the hard ground. She immediately let out a yelp of pain and brought her hand up to her head. Then she began to cry. "Silence!" a thundering voice shouted. As Sarah choked back her sobs to whimpers and saw that the voice was coming from Lord Raxirian. He sat in his throne in his usual crouched position, staring at her with his fiery eyes. Oh, thank goodness, Lord Raxian was here. He would make everything better and punish those goblins for. Why are you here without your armor? He asked her coldly. Ashterra was stunned. Never in life had he ever talked to her in such a way. My door. The goblins, was all she could say between held back sobs. What about the goblins? He asked, like the low rumble of thunder in the distance. They were commanded to bring you to me to begin your training. Why aren't you ready to train? I can't, Ashterra said before breaking down the door into sobs. Her head hurt with each beat of her heart. Silence! Lord Raxian commanded. Ashterra flinched at the command and did as he obeyed. Go get your armor, he said as if disgusted. Ashterra picked herself off the floor of the throne room, quivering a bit as she stood. She left then the moment she was sure that Lord Raxian couldn't see nor hear her. She wept. Why was he being so mean to her today? He'd never been like this ever. Ashterra made her way slowly to her room, passing by a small group of grinning goblins, the same that had taken her just moments ago. She wanted to yell at them, smack them, make them. One of the goblins jumped at her and barked, causing her to flinch and jump back. A roar of laughter came from the rest of the goblins who made their way past. Ashterra lowered her head. She couldn't do anything to them. She was too scared to. Soon, as Ashterra reached her room, she crossed the threshold, taking care to avoid pieces of splintered wood. She looked up and saw the room as she had left it. Ashterra's heart sank as she looked around, finally taking in what had happened only moments ago. She looked at herself in the cracked and broken remains of her mirror the goblins had carelessly smashed. Her face was stained with tears. Her goblin hair dangled and unkempt. The place where she had hit her head was swollen and began to bruise. She looked bad, but it was insignificant to how she felt. Ashterra's eyes were a haze with tears, making it difficult to sift through the broken remains for the items she needed to present herself to the Dark Lord. Ashterra worked, attempting to put on the pieces of plate. It was difficult. Yesterday, Brain had helped her with his powers, causing the pieces to float and attach themselves into place. Ashterra struggled to remember how the pieces went. It was difficult, but eventually she figured it out, even if she had trouble doing up a strap or two. As soon as she was done, she had stopped crying, but still felt terrible. She began making her way back to the throne room. She normally was excited when she walked this route, but after this morning, she was feeling uneasy. Soon she arrived, gingerly stepping over the threshold where the floor transformed from black cobbles to black marble. She was looking at the ground, hesitant to meet the Dark Lord's gaze. "Look at me," the rumbling voice of Lord Raxterian said. Ashterra obeyed and saw him seated in his throne. Bren was next to him, looking at her with worry in his eyes. "Good," Lord Raxterian continued. "It's time for combat training." The Dark Lord snapped his gauntlet fingers and the pair of goblins wheeled in what happened to be a wooden man into the room on a small hand cart. The goblin stopped and one of them pressed something onto the wooden man's back, and it jumped up from the cart and walked towards her. Ashterra swallowed hard when the wooden man stopped about an arm's length away. It towered over her by at least twice her own height. The wooden man held its arms across over his chest. "Draw your weapon," Lord Rexon said. Ashterra flinched as the wooden man suddenly moved, drawing two large wooden sticks that had since been resting at its sides. Ashterra was frozen, afraid of what the wooden man was about to do. "I said draw your weapon," Lord Raxterian said coldly. Ashterra hesitated. "Weapon? What weapon?" "The stick at your side," Lord Raxterian said condescendingly. Ashterra remembered and quickly grabbed the stick. She looked at it puzzled. How was this supposed to help her? Ashterra felt uncomfortable under her lord's gaze. There was no telling what he would do to her if she didn't do something. Ashterra clumsily held the stick in front of her, but didn't feel any more confident about her situation. The stick was only about the length of her forearm and easily a quarter the length of one of the sticks the wooden man held. "Good," Lord Textini said. "Now imagine a weapon, then channel that image into the stick." "Weapon? What kind of weapon?" Ashterra thought of a sword, the one like Lorelei had at his side. It was easily the length of the wooden man in front of her, and omitted with. Suddenly, a long blade shot from the end of the stick in a cloud of black smoke. The blade suddenly felt heavy, and Ashterra began to fall. She crashed to the floor, dropping the sword, which disappeared into a puff of smoke. Became the stick once more. "Get up," Lord Rexian said. Ashterra grabbed the stick and did so. She tried to imagine the sword, only this time smaller. The puff of smoke happened again, but this time a smaller, more manageable sword appeared. Ashterra smiled slightly. This made her situation feel a little less. "Fight!" Rexian said without warning. Suddenly, the wooden man sprung to life and swung one of its wooden sticks into Ashterra's side. She stumbled, surprised by the blow, and fell over. The attack hadn't hurt, but it had shaken her up. Ashterra lost her composure and started to cry. "Silence!" the Dark Lord said. Ashterra bit her lip, and she tried to hold back her tears. She stood, readying her weapon again. Her vision was blurred from tears, but she could still make out the wooden man fairly well. "Fight!" Rexarian said. The wooden man sprung to life a second time, swinging one of his sticks at her. She held her sword up to block it, but was unprepared for the force of the hit. It caused her to stumble, but she managed to catch herself only to be struck on her other side by the wooden man's other stick. Once again, Ashterra fell to the ground, tears began to weld in her eyes, but she pushed them back and stood. I don't think a child should be right out the back going to get some even if it's a woman, man, someone that's dual wielding. That's kind of a bit much for training a dual wielding, going to get somebody that's dual wielding at a young age. But we're gonna go with this. As a fan of dual wielding, I'm just saying. She readied herself again, her hands shaking with fear, and a few whimpers escaped from her quivering voice. Fight! Lord Rexon said again. The wooden man sprung to life, and Ashterra braced for an attack. The wooden man swung one of his sticks at her, but she swung the sword to hit it away. The blow connected, blocking the attack, but left her wide open to the wooden man's counterattack. Suddenly, Ashterra was swept out from her under her feet by a blow, then was kicked in midair. When she landed, the wind was knocked out of her. Ashterra tried to catch her breath, but only managed to cough. After her first breath, she broke out in sobs, unable and uncarried about hiding them. She hurt, she felt terrible, and she hated everything about her situation. Silence, Lord Rexine said. Ashterra kept sobbing. She didn't care about what he said. He was mean. Silence, he said again. Ashterra continued to ignore him. Finally, he stood from his throne. I said silence! Ashterra didn't care. She didn't know why he was being so mean to her. She didn't want to listen to him, nor do what he said. Almost immediately, she found the strength to speak, but only one word. No! She screamed at the top of her lungs, as best as she could before crumbling into sobs once more. Ashterra didn't pay attention to what Lord Rexon said next. Suddenly, she was grabbed by a pair of goblins standing by. She tried to fight back, but was helpless. The goblins managed to tie her hands and bar her to the wall. They hung her up by her hands on the wall, then removed her chest plate, exposing her bare back. She then heard Rexon next command. Whip her 5 lashes, he said. Ashterra's heart leapt with fear. She didn't want to be whipped. Bran began to yell from behind. You can't do that, he said. Ashterra felt the goblin's hesitation. Do as I command, Lord Rexon said. Ashterra struggled to get free, but it was no use. You can't do that, Brennan said again. She could die. Lord Rexon let out a thunderous boom that echoed through the throne room. If she dies, she's not fit to be my apprentice. Ashterra struggled against her bonds, but knew what was coming. Suddenly a cracked sound in her ears, followed by a fury burning on her back. Ashterra let out a scream of pain, then another as the whip licked her back a second time. Ashterra sobbed with agony. The pain was so intense, it felt unlike anything she had felt before. The third crack felt wet as something warm streamed down her back. The fourth crack made the pain radiate through her entire body as Ashterra screamed for it to stop. The last crack of the whip felt like 1,000 as Ashterra came to realization. This was her life and it would never change. Bryn sat in the healer's wing of the Fortress Grandex with a despotic Ashterra. The Dark Lord had commanded that she not be healed by traditional means, that she kept her scars a reminder of what happened to those who defy him. Ashterra's back was marked in crimson, where the whips had struck. The mark was almost symmetrical. 3 of the lashes had overlapped, creating what looked like a 3-pronged fork, facing downward on her back. On the left, in the top side of the fork, the other 2 lashes had created 2 almost mirrored crescents. Brent felt her pain and sadness for failing to prepare her for this day. He knew that something like this might happen. Knew it, yet he didn't train her at all. Bryn, Ashterra said. Her voice sounded defeated, almost as if part of her had died. I don't think I want to be Lord Rex's apprentice anymore. If Bryn had an art, it would have sunk. He was worried this would happen. Don't say things you don't mean, Ashterra, he said. I'm serious, she said. I don't want to be his apprentice anymore. He's mean, and I'm small. I can't do what he wants. That's nonsense, darling. You just need to practice some more. Brent felt the pain in her words as a stripe on his soul. But I can't do anything, she said, her tears coming back as her words became wells. He yells at me, lets me get beat up, and I can't do anything about it. Brent looked at her, his soul swelling to embrace her, to comfort her, tell her it would all be okay. But he stopped himself. That kind of coddling was the reason she was in this situation. He wouldn't fail her a second time, not if he could help it. No, that's enough of that, he said. You don't think that the Dark Lord got to be where he is today all in one go, do you? Ashterra stopped her sobs and listened. It was progress. The Dark Lord had to overcome mountains to get where he was. Do you think he never had a bad day? Do you think he never felt like giving up? Of course he did. But every time he was tossed to the ground, he got himself back up and continued fighting. Ashterra had a spark of hope return to her eyes as he continued. You may be small, you may be weak, but Ashterra, the Dark Lord, could have picked anybody in the world to be his apprentice. He could have picked the largest orc, the best swordsman, the fiercest orc, but he didn't. Do you know who he picked though? A baby girl. He knew what he was doing when he picked you. He knew what you could become. He didn't judge you based on what he saw in you then. He judged you based on what he knew you could become. You are his apprentice, not because you're the strongest fiend alive, but because he knows you will become even stronger. You are enough and more. As Ashterra's spirit seemed to return to her, she smiled. Brent smiled back. Now, he said, are you ready to give it another go? Ashterra stood, her expression strong. She nodded. Good. Ashterra found herself in a large, spacious room somewhere in the bowels of the fortress. The room was dimly lit by the same fire bastions that lit the halls. The effect gave the black copper floor a reddish glow, much like the halls themselves. In the center of the room, Ashterra noticed a small chair and a desk sitting across from a large bowl of what appeared to be sand. Take a seat, darling, Brent said, gesturing to the chair. Ashterra hesitantly sat and watched as Brent walked in front of her by the sand bastion. All right, he said. Are you ready to begin? Ashterra nodded hesitantly. What was Brent gonna do? Brent's forehead pulsed as he closed his eyes. Suddenly the sand from the bastion leaped up into the air and formed into a large rectangle. The shape of the book appeared in the rectangle as Brent talked. Ashterra looked at it with awe. She knew Brent could move things with his mind, but she didn't know he could control sand to move like that. After your morning meetings with the Dark Lord, you will come here for instruction with me, he said. She perked up, relieved that her training wouldn't be entirely in the hands of Lord Rexon. But what kind of instructions did Brent mean? Is something wrong? Brent said. No. She then paused. Well, maybe. What do you mean by instruction? Brent's face turned perceptive. All kinds, I suppose, he said. Like what? Well, an apprentice needs to be intelligent, not just strong. Different challenges will confront you every step of your journey, and you'll need to know how to deal with them. Journey? Ashterra said. But I'm not going anywhere. Brent chuckled. It's just a figure of speech, he said. But perhaps I should show you what I mean. Sounds fair? Ashterra nodded. All right, Brent said. Now, what is your favorite food? Ashterra thought back to the night before when she had a cave newt steak. Her mouth started to water. Cave newt, she said. Brent gave a quick nod. Suddenly, the rectangle formed into the shape of a large lizard about the size of Ashterra's self. The lizard scuttled about, making quick, erratic movements as it meandered from side to side. It seemed so lifelike that Ashterra forgot that it was made of sand. Suddenly, the lizard stopped, looking directly at her and hissed. Ashterra froze with fear. Any sense of awe and wonder she had a moment ago was now replaced with dread. The lizard jumped at her, mouth open. Ashterra flinched, holding up her arms to protect herself and letting out a scream. Nothing happened. Reluctantly, Ashterra lowered her arms and saw the lizard frozen in midair. Soon the dread was replaced with awe once more. Now that it was up close, Ashterra could make out the tiny details that she had been unable to see. The lizard's skin looked smooth and slimy. Small rings dotted it to give it variety. The eyes of the creature were small and looked almost blank. Its small teeth looked sharp and pointed. Its tail had two separate ridges that looked like fins on a fish. This is cave newt, Brent said. Whoa, Ashterra said under her breath. Cave newts are small, as you can see, and offer little threat to individuals. However, they can be rather aggressive, their territory being in the dark depths of the caves and raft. They are prey animals and can multiply rather quickly, thus making them a prime animal for farming. Even though they are rather harmless, if you are bitten by one, you can find yourself developing a serious infection. If this happens, fever and death are likely to occur. Ashterra took it all in. She hadn't been aware that her favorite food had been an animal, let alone one that had so much about it to learn. But enough of that, Brent said. What we really want to know with this assessment is how to kill it. Wait, what? Ashterra said, but Brent continued as if he hadn't heard. Brent produced a slender stick from his robes and pointed it to the floating cave newt. Now, the cave newt can be rather difficult to dispatch, he said. Hmm. He made slashing motions across the creature's leg and tail, then the limb split from the body, but remained floating. If you remove a limb, the cave newt would simply grow back a new one. As if to emphasize the point, the floating limbs reattached themselves to the body of the cave newt as if they had never been separated. So, Brent continued, you could always try to pierce his heart, but locating that can be difficult as it varies from cave newt to cave newt. However, there is one true and tested way to kill a cave newt: decapitation. Decapit what? Ashterra said, fumbling over the word. Then Brent smiled a fiendish smile. His sharp teeth bore the look of blood and lust and hunger, a look that made her a bit queasy. She had never seen this side of Brent before. It means, he said, his voice fiendish as his expression, cut its head off. Brent slashed the air with his stick, and the head separated from the cave newt's neck before dissolving into the sand and falling to the floor. As Syria suddenly felt sick to her stomach, Brent turned to her, his face suddenly warm, encouraging, exactly the opposite of what it had been mere moments ago. Now, darling, you give it a go. Before Ashterra could even think about refusing, the sand of the floor flew over to the basin and reformed into a cave newt. Ashterra hesitantly stood from her seat and walked in front of the small, mangeling lizard. It hissed at her several times as she watched. Now, darling, Ben said gently, this cave newt isn't real. I'm in control. No need to fear. Just draw your weapon and summon a sword. Be sure to make it sharp. Ashterra fumbled with the small black stick at her side, and did as she had done earlier that day. A sword shot out from the end. It was getting easier to do that. She held her blade out towards the cave newt. The lizard began to circle her, and she turned to follow it, making sure to keep her ground. Her heart was thumping, trying to climb its way out of her throat. She felt sick, almost to the point of vomiting. Then suddenly the lizard jumped at her. Ashterra squeaked, closed her eyes, and slashed. Good job, darling, Brent said. Ashterra opened her eyes in time to see the headless body of the cave newt dissolve in sand. She smiled. She had done it. She fell to her knees, her legs feeling weak. Relief washed over her like the wave as her breath went faint. Then she gladly threw up. That's funny. Ashterra practiced with Brent for the remainder of the day, practicing things like combat standards, learning things like different types of weapons, and even non-combat things like letters and numbers. It had all gone by so fast. It had been enjoyable for the most part, but now it was the end of the day. Brent told her that she had to greet the Dark Lord for her evening meeting. She hesitantly walked away to the throne room all alone. During her time with Brent, she had felt strong, capable, but now she was reflecting on the morning, and all her previous confidence dissolved like the training apprentice Brent made with sand. Ashterra shuffled her feet as she approached the throne room entrance. She hesitated just outside the doorway, making sure to keep herself from being seen from inside. Maybe she had just gone to her room, waiting until tomorrow, too. Come on in, the Dark Lord's Phoenix voice said, almost cheerfully. Ashterra's heart sank. It figured he knew she was there. Ashterra walked into the throne room. The Dark Lord sat waiting for her in his throne room in his usual Scotch position. His glared at her with his fiery red eyes. Once she thought they were pretty and warm. Now, however, they sent the cold chill down her spine. What can I help you with, darling? The Dark Lord said, mocking. Ashterra hesitated, but then spoke. Brent said you wanted to see me. Her voice was almost a whisper, and she didn't have the courage to make it any louder. The Dark Lord let out a laugh which seemed to shake the entire room. Suddenly he stood and walked towards her. Ashterra cowered, afraid of what he would do to her. To her surprise, he didn't even acknowledge her as he walked past. Ashterra turned to him. He seemed a giant to her. Then he spoke. How about a race? He said nonchalantly. Ashterra looked up at him. Why did he want to have a race? If you win, he continued, then I promise I'll command the goblins to leave you be tomorrow. As Sarah perked up, she remembered the morning and how terrible the goblins had been. Anything that would keep them away from her was worth any price. Do you agree to the terms? Ashterra looked at him to see if he was being serious. He stared down at her with his fiery eyes, like two red stars in an otherwise black sky. He was being serious. As Sierra nodded and the Dark Lord turned away, he held his hand in the air, and a large sword appeared from the air into his grip. He slashed the ground, and a line appeared on the black marble floor where the sword had cut. Then the sword disappeared into a puff of black smoke, much like the warlock's blade Ashterra had. The Dark Lord readied himself on the line, as if prepared to sprint. "Prepare yourself, girl," he said. "First one to the stables and back wins." This ought to be interesting. As Sarah readied herself on the line, she was a strong runner. Bryn said so himself. Even better, the Saber were just down the hallway outside the throne room, and a race was something she knew she could. "Go!" the Dark Lord said before pushing off the starting line with so much speed that Esther barely had time to blink before he was out of sight and down the hall. Ashterra ran after him, but soon realized that her pace was a snail compared to sprinting Deerwolf. Ashterra kept up the chase, but soon slowed to a walk. This was pointless. She'd never win. Ashterra wanted to fall in tears. But what did she expect from Lord Roxon? She had guessed he wouldn't have gone easy on her, so she decided to quit and turn in for the night. Let the goblins call, like Lord Rexon would really have called them off anyway. Ashterra traveled down the winding sets of halls until she came to her chambers. A new door had been installed to her surprise. She opened the door, then stepped inside, only to pause. Inside was nothing. Not her furniture, her mirror, her bed, nothing except the armored mannequin. Ashterra felt herself die inside, and tears began to flow from her eyes uncontrollably. Everything that could have happened today hadn't really managed to break her, but this did. With tears streaming down her cheeks and dripping to the floor, Ashterra walked back to the throne room. Inside, she saw the Dark Lord in his throne. Esther didn't care if he saw her. What more could he do to her besides kill her? "Give them back," she said. "Give what back?" Lord Rexon said almost joyfully. Ashterra wanted to punch him, hurt him, but she knew she couldn't. She was weak. "My things," she said through wails. "Give them back." "I didn't take your things, girl," he said in his own low, booming version of a hiss. "Give them back." The Dark Lord straightened himself in his throat, but Ashterra didn't finish. "If you want to know who took your things," he said, "it was the goblins. The same you encountered this morning. Give them back. Make them. But I can't." The Dark Lord paused for a moment as if looking her over. "Then maybe you never deserved them to begin with," he said. Ashterra stood there gasping between sighs. She now understood what it meant to be Lord Roxon's apprentice. Nothing would be given to her. She had to earn everything she wanted. Here in the fortress, the currency was power, strength, and she had neither. She wanted to make them pay for what they had done to her. Now, however, she couldn't even stop herself from sobbing. Defeated, Esther turned away from the Dark Lord. She somehow knew that this would have been pointless. Ashterra returned to her room, the tears having long since gone dry. She closed her door, locked it, then curled up in the corner. She was dead inside. What she had been in the morning was gone, and she knew it would never ever return. Bryn waited in the throne room for the goblins to retrieve Ashterra for the morning. He thought the treatment was cruel, but then, what had he expected? He knew the Dark Lord wouldn't shower his apprentice with roses and praise. He was stupid to think he could have raised her like a normal human. It was just, he had enjoyed it, being kind, caring, loving. Unfortunately, she was the one who had to pay the price for his folly. A pack of goblins came in through the entryway of the throne room, carrying a small armor-clad, golden-haired girl just like the day before. They threw her up to the ground with a thud. Unlike yesterday, however, Ashterra didn't weep, didn't even so much as make a sound. Bryn looked at her, and if he had a heart, would have felt it break. The girl's eyes looked dead. There was nothing in them, no emotions, no desires, nothing. The Dark Lord called for the training automation to be brought in as he had the day before. He readied himself, and the Dark Lord commanded Ashterra to do the same. The young girl drew her weapon and the fight began, only to be cut short when the automation struck her in the side and downing her. Ashterra didn't make a sound as she was commanded to stand and fight again. Bryn watched with sadness as she fought, was beaten, then silently stood to fight again. After one bout, the automation struck Ashterra in the head with a loud crack which reverberated throughout the throne room. Bryn held his breath as she fell to the floor. "By the seven, Ashterra, I'm sorry. I'm so sorry." Ashterra remained on the floor for a moment before the Dark Lord commanded her to stand. She did so without a sound. Bryn felt something he could only describe as heartbreak as she stood. She had a stream of blood running down her face, but even that didn't seem to faze her. The Dark Lord held up a gauntlet hand. Enough. Brent fought back tears. The Dark Lord gestured to him. Get her to the healer wing, she said. Brent was tempted to revile the Dark Lord, even to make an attempt to harm him, but he resisted, even if he could manage to injure Lord Roxon. Brent couldn't bring himself to be disloyal. The Dark Lord had saved his life, and he was forever in his debt. Still, watching him torture Ashterra was almost too much to bear. The healers in the wing had repaired Ashterra's cut on her forehead, but other than that, found nothing wrong. Afterwards, during Brent's instructions, Ashterra hardly made a peep. Even when he had tried to prod her with questions, he was barely able to get her to mutter one-word answers. Something was definitely wrong with her. Regardless of what the healers had said, Brent was tempted to prod her mind with its subtlety, but refused. No, that's not how you deal with your child, he told himself. Still, what was he supposed to do? Perhaps it was something that would improve as the weeks drew on. But day after day passed and nothing changed. Ashterra still struggled against the automation with no improvements to her fighting style. She hardly spoke during instruction time, and every time the goblins brought her in, she reacted like a lifeless sack of dirt. Okay, eventually Brent had enough and decided to confront the Dark Lord. It was the evening. Ashterra had retired to her chambers. Brent had been forbidden from even visiting her chambers, let alone aiding her in the morning. For all he knew, the place was a mess, and who knew what the goblins had done to her things. It felt unnatural for him enough to force him to this confrontation. The Dark Lord sat on his throne in his typical slouch and compact position. Brent approached the throne. If he had a heart, he'd say it would be obnoxiously pounding. He, however, made sure to hold himself in the air of dignity and calm regardless. What is it, Bowbear? The Dark Lord said. I come to talk to you about the girl. The Dark Lord gave a sigh and straightened up in his throne. Very well, speak, he said. I don't know what happened that night after she left me, but something happened to break her spirits to the point where I'm beginning to think she'll never recover. Is that all? The Dark Lord let out a small chuckle. Brent didn't know whether he should feel foolish or livid at his Dark Lord's callous reaction. Perhaps, the Dark Lord continued, you should give a second thought before approaching me with such trifles. Brent felt his composure break slightly, but quickly recover. Trifles, he said? I would think that being your chosen for your successor would account for more than trifles in your esteem. The Dark Lord tossed back into his throne before answering. What would you have me do, Barbara? Coddle her? Cushion her every footfall? Brush her hair when it gets unkept? I would have you not bear her to a vegetated state. How has this day, no, this week, been beneficial to progress when she can't even summon the energy, even will when she's tossed to the floor? It's madness, and I will have none of it any longer. Oh? The Dark Lord said. Are you threatening me, Barbire? Brent stood his ground, letting silence be his answer. There was silence, its tension built in the room. Then suddenly the Dark Lord let out a booming laugh that sounded like thunder vibrating through the throne room. I knew there was a reason why I chose you to be her teacher, he said. The Dark Lord straightened himself in his throne once again and held up a gauntlet finger. One more door, he said. Give her one more day. You may not see it, but her epi is simply a chrysalis transforming the grub into a deadly fire wasp. We need to be patient and let her hatch. Brent felt resentful, but supposed that was as good as a deal as he was going to get. Fine, he said. One more day, but only one, or so help me, I'll bring this entire fortress down if I need to get her out. Damn. The fortress saw back into his throne, then brushed his gesture to send Brent away. It was as if he was deliberately refusing to grace Brent's threat with a response. Brent turned and left the throne room with his resentment. Soon, however, his thoughts turned to Ashterra. Just hang in there, darling, for one more day. That's all you'll need to wait. Brent stood in the throne room the next morning beside the Dark Lord, who was seated in his throne. He watched as the pack of goblins ran inside and tossed the young girl to the floor. Once again, she didn't make a sound, as if she picked herself up. Brent glanced at the Dark Lord as the king of the fiends gestured for the automation to be brought in. Brent watched as two goblins wheeled in the device and activated. The automation stepped forward, stopping before Ashterra. Ready your weapon, the Dark Lord said. Brent watches as Tara grabbed her warlock's blade and summoned a sword with it. I like how it has a new name now. Fight! The automation leaped to life and attack. Ashterra blocked the automation's first attack, but ultimately succumbed to a sweep at her torso. Ready yourself, the Dark Lord said before Ashterra stood to begin again. Fight! Ashterra attempted to flinch but was struck in the legs. The pack of goblins had stayed to watch her this morning and jeered at her as she failed. Ashterra readied herself when prompted by the Dark Lord and once again engaged in a fight that ended in the young girl on her stomach on the black marble floor. Bryn glanced at the Dark Lord, resentment in his mind. You see, nothing has changed. The Dark Lord gave the command for Ashterra to ready herself again. Bryn watched. If he had a heart, it would have been full of pain. The Dark Lord commanded the fight to commence and Bryn waited for the inevitable failure. However, when the automation struck, Ashterra flinched flawlessly, then parried, then blocked all with the grace of a well-seasoned soldier. Ashterra ducked, swayed, and sidestepped the automation's attacks, waiting for the opening for an attack. After one duck, however, one of the automation staffs got tangled in Ashterra's hair, throwing the young girl off balance. She was unable to recover before being struck by the other stick in the temple and falling to the floor. The goblins jeered at her as she struggled to get on her hands and knees. Bryn himself winced at the blow. Suddenly, Bryn realized his resentment had been replaced with surprise and hope. Watching the young girl flinch and parry the way she had made him feel proud and made him want to cheer as loud as he could for her. He kept his composure, however, and figured the girl's performance had been a fluke. Even now, he presumed the fight would be called and that he would be commanded to see her injuries, and Ashterra started to scream, not in pain but in anger. Ashterra screamed like a volcano erupting. She put everything she had been bottling up into it. She hated this wooden man. She hated the Dark Lord. She hated the goblins. She would make them pay. She would make them all pay. She had been patient like Bryn had been teaching her, waiting for a moment to strike, but the wooden man didn't leave a single weakness for her to exploit. The goblin's urine only made her more angry, so angry that a word at least she thought it was a word, came to her mind as if a whisper from afar off. Renix. She said the word under her breath, but it was filled with as much anger as she could muster. Suddenly, she felt a rush of energy flow through her. It felt good. She started to scream louder and louder, with enough energy that it seemed she started to scream fire. She looked at the wooden man. She was going to sink her sword into his chest. She hardly would have had it not been for her. Ashterra grabbed a hold of her hair. Her long golden hair, her most prized feature, had betrayed her. Ashterra looked at the locks with disgust. It was with this had caused her the most recent humiliation. This most recent failure. Ashterra summoned a knife from her warlock blade. She held her hair in one hand, the knife in the other. Then with one quick slice, she severed it. She looked at the locks in her gauntlet hand. Red flashes of what looked like sparkling lightning circled her arm as the hair turned black. Ashterra dropped them to the floor. The color change was odd and she didn't care. She looked up at the wooden man full of energy and hatred. She took a step towards it in a sprint. Everything seemed to slow. Ashterra threw close to the wooden man. Its arm slowly moved in an attempt to block the knife she held. Ashterra felt an urge to smile at what was about to happen, but the anger that carried her overpowered the feeling in an instant. She struck her hand forward and into the wooden man. The knife snuck in like he was made of wax. The wooden man fell, and she hopped on top of it, stabbing it repeatedly. She hated it, and every stab felt to her as pleasurable as scratching an itchy bug bite. Soon, the anger burnt away, and the sparks that had been circling her arm had stopped. She stood the rest of the room, finally coming back to her attention. It was silent. She turned to the goblins who had been jeering at her with a scowl. They appeared stunned and seemed to recoil at her gaze. Suddenly, she heard booming laughter. Ashterra turned towards it. It was the Dark Lord. He was standing and held out a gauntlet hand in her direction. Brent stood beside him, looking at her with what could only be described as amazement. He smiled, his mouth wide with joy. Then the Dark Lord spoke, addressing the entire room in what seemed like the entire world. Behold, my apprentice. Alright, chapter 4. How far you've come. Okay, this is going to be different. Okay, Captain Zed and his lieutenants hustled down the hallway to the Dark Lord's apprentice. The mission handed to them from the Dark Lord himself was simple: apprehend his apprentice and bring her to him in chains. Zed had heard about the apprentice and how she had bested others before, but this was going to be different. Zed and his lieutenants were Braba, the elite foot soldiers of all orcs. Oh god. Zed and his lieutenants were incredibly skilled and capable. Once they had found themselves surrounded by an army of men during the retaliations after the fall of the blighted Lexicon, they only had a force of maybe 50, but had managed to stand against an army of at least 1,000 and only losing 3. That's actually kind of impressive. Zed and his lieutenants were probably the most deadly rabbi in existence, which is why he found it almost insulting to be assigned such a simple task. Zed caught himself. Remember what the Dark Lord had said: do not take her lightly, and make sure to use deadly force. It didn't matter if she was alive when they brought her to him in chains. Zed looked at his lieutenants. Together they were 6, and the Dark Lord's apprentice 1. This was almost too easy. Uh-huh. They arrived at their apprentice's door. All was silent. It was still early morning. The sun hadn't even risen yet. Odds were the apprentice was sound asleep and completely vulnerable to an ambush. Zed ordered his Zords to surround the door, 3 on each side. The poor girl was about to have a rude wake-up call, not even given a fighting chance. Zed stood at the back of the 3 on his sides and gave a gesture to the first orc on the other side. Lieutenant Boris signaled from him to kick the door in. Boris nodded and stood himself in front of the door. Zed drew his sword and readied his shield. The rest of the lieutenants followed suit. Boris raised a mauled leg, then kicked the door. There was a loud crack as the boot hit the door, and the door fell off its hinges, except the wrong way. Wait, how do you kick the door the wrong way? Zed had to shake himself out of his sun sunder. The Dark Lord's apprentice had kicked the door off its hinges as if riding it with her feet and knocking Bor into the back wall. It had all happened in a split second, and the apprentice was still held to the door by her momentum. Zed started to yell, "Attack!" but not before the apprentice had kicked the door and kicking the nearest lieutenant in the jaw, her boot meeting face with a loud crunch. Okay, I get what happened now. Now I see why they went back. Okay. Black blood splattered on the floor as the apprentice drew a stick that became a mace and slammed it into the next lieutenant's chest, knocking him back. One of the lieutenants from behind her ran towards her, preparing to bash her with his shield, but she jumped in the air and performed a backflip over him. The apprentice then kicked off him and sent him crashing into the lieutenant she had hit with a mace. Zed saw the former look of bewilderment as the latter lost consciousness. The apprentice landed from her backflip atop the last lieutenant from the breaching side, wrapped her legs around his neck, then sprung, using the momentum to throw him to the ground with a loud clash. The shield-bearing lieutenant turned towards her, but the apprentice's mace transformed into a boomerang, which she threw. The shield-bearing lieutenant ducked just in time for the boomerang to fly over him. I like the fact that she's using a boomerang. Legit, no joke. Zed ducked as well in the nick of time and heard his lieutenant jeer. Zed knew better and watched as the boomerang flew back, striking the jeering lieutenant in the helm, knocking him unconscious before ricocheting upwards, clipping the chain on one of his fire basins lighting the hallway. The fire basin fell crashing down on the last standing lieutenant who had recovered from being flung by the apprentice's momentum. Zed was the last orc standing and held his shield up as he studied the apprentice. She had black hair that fell to her shoulders and a pale white skin, as white as a ghost. She also was small, reaching just 1.5 meters tall, if that. She glared at him, her eyes red, pierced like the Dark Lord's, but lacking the glow. By the 7th, she looked human, but seemed more a demon. The apprentice held out her hand and called her boomerang as it circled back the other way without looking at it. The boomerang transformed into a staff, and she readied herself for a charge. Zed didn't wait for her to act and charged her first. She was fast enough and charged for him as well. Zed swung his sword at her, but she vaulted in the air. He quickly held up his shield as the staff clanged off of it. She felt the other side of him, and he turned to face her just in time to be swept off his feet by the staff and slammed into the ground. Zed tried to recover, but was hit by something that felt heavy, causing him to lose his breath. Zelt rolled over weakly, trying to breathe. He saw the apprentice's back walking towards the throne room. It all made sense to him now, as he struggled for breath. He and his lieutenants were simply a test for her, nothing more. The Dark Lord had no expectation that they'd be able to bring her to him in chains. As she turned the corner, Zed couldn't help but fear the young girl before passing it into unconsciousness. Damn, I thought that squad of Reverend would have given you some trouble at least, the Dark Lord said upon Ashterra's arrival to the throne room. He was seated in his throne in his usual slouch position. Oh please, they were hardly a proper warm-up, Ashterra replied huffily. She had been used to these morning battles since she was a young child. She had trouble deciding them at first, but that only lasted for about 2 months. At first it was goblins, then after a year and a half of straight victories, her master sent orcs she never lost, regardless of however close it seemed to any of the fiends who had the pleasure of lasting more than 5 minutes. I kind of figured that this was a time jump. I'm like, once I read that she was switching her weapon from a boomerang to a staff, I'm like, this got to be a time jump. Okay, you probably be pleased to hear that squad once won a battle against an entire army. An army of what? Dermpups? The truth was, these morning fights were almost boring. It'd been a while since the Tyria experienced any real challenge. Turns out fighting one giant sand monster after another when training with your barbarian caretaker would do that, she thought. If anything, the morning raids were getting annoying. Ashterra wanted something more, something to truly test the limits of her skills. But there was nothing in the Fortune's Ganas that could do that. Well, short of challenging the Dark Lord himself, like that's gonna happen anytime soon, Ashterra thought. She couldn't even beat him in a foot race yet. Hmm. The barbarian informed me that it's your, what did he call it, birthday? Is it that time already, Ashterra said? The Dark Lord grunted. I should punish your sarcasm, he said. Ashterra couldn't help but smirk. Even if you could find someone in the fortress to carry out that order, I'd soon change my mind, she said. The Dark Lord chuckled and straightened himself. How about a race, he said. Ashterra smiled. Every year on her birthday, Lord Raxon would challenge her to a race. He had done this since the day after her 5th birthday. Shortly after, she officially became his apprentice. Every year she lost. However, Ashterra had been planning, preparing for this. She couldn't help but finger a small ring on the side of her mail. It was something of her own design, an idea she got from watching rabbit troopers train. The rabbits, specially trained orc foot soldiers, were forced to run while carrying boulders. It was meant to help them be nimble on the battlefield while wearing a full set of plated mail. Sarah figured that she could do the same and had a special set of armor made with enchanted weights set in to hold her down. Then she practiced running as fast as she could. If everything went according to plan, when she removed the weights, she'd only be that much faster. The Dark Lord stood from his throne and walked down to her. I assume from your smile you accept, he said. Of course, but one condition. Lord Rexon looked at her for a moment. What? He said thirstily. I want to propose a wager, she replied. The Dark Lord paused for a moment before chuckling. Very well, he said. What do you want if you win? As Sarah paused for a moment, she hadn't actually expected her request for a wager to work. Come to think about it, she wasn't even really sure why she had asked for a wager to begin with. Now that she had it, and that was she certain she'd win, she wasn't sure what to ask for. Then it hit her like a punch to the face. Dax Moxus, she said. Dax Moxus was the largest and most popular of the Moxdrami gladiatorial circuits, or so she had heard from bannering orcs in the brackets. Their recent chatter let her know that there were championship events happening in the city of Raxira this week. You want to attend Dax Muggers? The Dark Lord said. No, Ashterra said. I want to compete. The Dark Lord chuckled once more. Very well, he said, but if I win, you'll owe me 10,000 bare-knuckled hand stand-ups. Damn. On a bed of nails, because why not? That damn. Ashterra whitened her eyes, but quickly hid it under a wicked smile. Oh hell, 10,000. Ashterra was required to do bare-knuckle handstands ups every morning anyway, but only 100. But what the Dark Lord was asking was, well, a hell of a lot more. And on a bed of nails. Fine, she said. The Dark Lord readied himself at the stench in the floor he had cut 8 years ago. Asher did the same. The thought of 10,000 handstand push-ups worried her, but she didn't know why. She wouldn't have to do them. Asher instead focused on Doc's markers. Oh yes, her plan would work. She'd win easily. Same rules as every year prior, she asked. Yes, Lord Roxon said. To the stables and back without killing each other. Other than that, anything goes. Ashterra smiled wickedly. This was going to be cut and dry victory for her if she ever knew one. On your mark, the Dark Lord said. Ashterra eyes the hallway that led out the throne room and far into the distance. Get set. Suddenly, the Dark Lord drove a fist into the marble beneath her, causing the stone to snap and crumble and knocking her off her feet. Go! The Dark Lord took off from the starting line and soon was down the hallway. Wow, he had to cheat though? Really? Ashterra yelled with anger as she watched him shrink down in the distance. He had cheated to get a head start. She had hoped that she wouldn't had needed to pull her own dirty trick this early in the race, but she saw no other way around it. The Dark Lord was going to do everything he could to make sure she performed those stand-ups. So she needed to do everything to make sure he take her to the Dark Markets. Ashterra begrudgingly grabbed the ring she had been fingering earlier and pulled it. It stretched out a long cord, then several large plates fell away from her armor. Immediately she ran what seemed like seconds. Ezra had caught up to the Dark Lord running so fast she could have easily left him behind. There would be time for that, but first payback. Ashterra jumped on the wall and started running along it. She made sure to keep pace with the Dark Lord so he saw her. When he did, she smiled at him, then jumped to the floor, making sure to destroy it through to the next floor below. Ashterra made sure to jump from the floor and prevent falling through it herself. She looked back from the opposite side of a large hole between her and the Dark Lord, whom had stopped at the hole's edge. Then, to add insult to injury, she waved at him before continuing down the hallway as fast as she had before. That's funny as hell. Ashterra didn't really think that hole would stop Dark Lord for long, but it was more than symbolic nature behind the gesture. Either way, there was no way the Dark Lord could keep up with her, not at her current pace. At the moment, Ashterra was faster than any horse, daring wolf, or any other animal she could think of. There was absolutely nothing the Dark Lord could do to catch up. Sort of. Suddenly, the Dark Lord was beside her. Bewildered, Ashterra glanced at him. She noticed right away that several pieces of his armor seemed slimmer than they had previously. Sons of bitch! He had the same weighted plates that she had. That would explain why the blacksmith knew what exactly she was talking about when she had requested that kind of modification. The Dark Lord waved at her before jumping to the wall and then the floor in an attempt to break it just like she had. Ashterra wasn't about to let him get away with her own dirty tricks, so she jumped just as the Dark Lord hit the floor. She flew over him just as he tried to rebound. Oh no you don't, she said with a grunt. Just as much strength as she could muster, she kicked downward into the Dark Lord. The result sent the King of Fiends downward, making his rebound pointless. Ashterra smiled wickedly as she saw him fall to the floor below. She laughed as she ran. She couldn't believe that it had actually worked. Now there was nothing the Dark Lord could do to beat her. Ashterra didn't let that slow her though, and she continued to pace all the way to the stables. She touched the edge of the entrance to the stables and turned back to the throne room. There was no sign of Lord Racton, and all she needed to do was make her way back, and she would. Suddenly, a gaunting hand erupted through the black marble cobbled floor and grabbed a hold of Ashterra's ankle as she was in mid-pivot. The rest of the Dark Lord rose through the cobbles as he threw her downward to the floor below. Ashterra couldn't avoid falling and hit the lower level like a meteor. That's funny. The wind was knocked out of her, but it almost didn't matter. The Dark Lord was now ahead of her, and she had no time to waste. It took a few seconds for Ashterra to catch her breath again before she took off down the hallway of the lower floor, pushing herself even faster than she had run before. Panic started to set in, but she banished it. No, she wasn't gonna lose. She just needed to get to the floor above. Ashterra looked ahead for rubble from the holes that had been made in this floor ceiling. Soon enough, she saw it as the holes that had been jumped up the wall and up the holes as the Dark Lord jumped over her. Okay. She found herself behind him, but only by a meter or two. The race was close enough that she wouldn't risk trying to trip up her master without fear of causing her to lose. The fact that Rexer didn't do the same at the moment told her he felt the same way as well. Now it wasn't the time for dirty tricks, it was the time for her to push herself past her limits. Ashterra focused on the goal, the throne room ahead. It was in sight and approaching fast. She pushed herself, focused her strength in her legs, but she couldn't close the gap. The throne room drew nigh, and the reality of her impending loss approached. No, don't think that way. You haven't lost yet. She put everything into her legs, every bit of energy she could muster. But nothing changed. She had come so close and grew frustrated herself. Why? Why couldn't she draw more? Why couldn't she find the strength to win? It was stupid. She had worked so hard for this day, for this event, but it wasn't enough. Why, why? Suddenly a word came to her mind. It was a strange word, familiar, but she didn't know from where. It wasn't even a word that she understood, but it came to her like a ray of hope. The word sat there on her mind, pestering her to give it a voice. The more she ignored it, the harder it was to keep in. Suddenly, she found her lips moving as if on her own, mouthing new vowels as the words flowed from her tongue. Renix. Suddenly, red sparks danced about her eyes. She glanced at her legs and saw the more red sparks flowing about them like swarming fire wasps. Arching like lightning, energy flowing through her body, and her legs seemed to get faster. Quickly, the gap between her and the Dark Lord closed, and she inched ahead. She glanced up at the Dark Lord and smirked as he glanced down at her with what saw as astonishment. The throne room threshold came, and she passed through it ahead. Ashterra fell to her knees and slid under until she came to a stop in front of the dark throne. The sparks disappeared. She fell on her back. Inhaling deep breaths, she held up a fist in triumph. She was exhausted, she was spent, but she was victorious. Alright, y'all. That was actually chapter 3 and 4. That was chapter 3 and 4. Again, book made by Andy and Atwood. I work with this guy. He gave me this book for my birthday. So now we had a time skip. Now we see Ashura actually OP. Probably stronger than the Dark Lord now. That's where we're at. We're gonna start with Dark. We're gonna start with chapter 5. Next time we do this, y'all, we got through 2 chapters today. Hey, seriously, y'all, I appreciate y'all coming by and checking this out. Again, if you haven't, the link to this book is in the description. Guess got as far because you don't mind giving a like, comment, and or subscribe. Remember to stay hydrated, y'all. I'm not even done my coffee yet. Mm. Also, thank you for those who came by. Check this out, have a seat with us. You always more than welcome. Sure, check out my other content as well. I do coffee. I'm a host of the Coffee and Conversation podcast. And also, I'm currently starting Persona 3. And also, I'm doing the My Rise thing. And I'm still playing Shadow Heart. Y'all take care of each other. Again, thank you very much. They say out of bad trouble, good trouble is okay, y'all. Till next time, we are out of here. Later, y'all.